Good day to you. I don't know how familiar you are with the bars and restaurants on Main Street in Stroudsburg, but there are at least 4 or 5 bars that are owned by an Irish oriented company called Galloway. And they own, for example, Sarah's Corner, they own Jock and Jill's, they own Sheemsa, they own Yard of Ale. And all of these bars have a menu that offer things that are kind of different from what you see in the usual American Red Robin, for example, or some of the other fast food type chains. One of the items on the menu at Sheemsa, for example, is a shepherd's pie. Now, I don't know if you ever had a shepherd's pie, but mostly if you grow up in America, you think of a pie as something that is sweet or fruity. A shepherd's pie comes from Great Britain, including Ireland, and it consists of a meat inside of pastry, and then on the top it has mashed potatoes. And it was the meal of shepherds working in the fields. And it's just one example of how two cultures, in this case the United States and Ireland, intermingle with each other or interact with each other, which is what this chapter is all about. It's all about contact between cultures as we take on chapter 13. And in particular, this Galloway connection to Ireland involved the owners of Galloway going over to Ireland and making purchases of some wood to come back and build the bars. And so you have actually Americans going to Ireland and then returning from Ireland, and through the people that they meet, you start to have an exchange between culture. So as we head into this chapter now, let's talk about the first element that the book takes on, which is colonialism. This is one of the major ways that cultures interacted with each other. And we sort of look back on colonialism as a time period of regret in some ways, because it basically involved Europeans through the might of their navies, first Spain and then England and also Holland, sailing around the world and colonizing places, setting up camps and bringing the values from England and the values from those cultures into these foreign or colonialized countries. Prior to colonialism, people had lived for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years in isolated communities. And so when colonialism occurred, it started to spread European values and interests. And the reason that it's looked so poorly upon from the vantage point of 2015 is because the people from cultures other than European cultures were often devalued. In fact, the word Orient is a word that's pejorative, actually. If you call China as part of the Orient, or if you say that a Chinese person is Oriental, it's a pejorative term. It's an insult, because that word was invented to describe all of those cultures that were to the east of England, which were lesser than English culture. And so we don't, generally speaking, use Orient today except to discuss it in an academic sense. Next, the book goes on to discuss Hawaii, one of our 50 states, a very interesting prior culture that is now part of the United States. It was a culture that had a kind of a class system set up like India, where you had a ruling class, you had priests or experts. Notice that priests were considered experts. You had commoners, and you had slaves. Well, Captain James Cook, part of the British Navy, sailed into Hawaii in 1778, and he started to describe Hawaiians as others. And others has a very strong meaning to it. It's a term that means anybody who is other than European and therefore has inferior values and customs and habits, etc. The Hawaiian population was susceptible, like a lot of indigenous populations, to disease. And there are not that many, quote, pure Hawaiians that exist today, but it was one of those islands that existed unto itself that was influenced strongly in interacting with England. Next up is Australia. You may know the folklore about Australia. It just has a very dramatic history. Captain Phillip came along 18 years later than Captain James Cook. And Captain Phillip from England arrived with several boats, several ships full of prisoners. England wanted to purge the prisoners from their jails, so they sent a lot of petty thieves, not necessarily murderers, but people who were involved in robberies and other kind of petty crimes. They sent them to Australia. And these people then were the first wave of immigrants. They were then followed by other British people who wanted to emigrate. And they set up cattle farms and regular farms. The problem is they started to interact with the Aboriginals, the indigenous peoples that live in Australia, and they started to interact with them in a way that was trying to wipe them out. Captain James Phillip himself decreed that the Aboriginals should be treated as equals, but the ensuing settlers that came from Britain didn't believe so, and they ended up doing really heinous acts like putting arsenic in the food of Aboriginals to wipe them out or eradicate them. Next up is the concept of cultural imperialism. An imperial country is a country that tries to take over the world or try to take over another country, usually through force. We refer to cultural imperialism, though, as that kind of imperialism where one country's values are placed into another country's at the expense of that country's values. And it occurs both through the military. The United States has had forces in Iraq and Iran, and the book describes how in Iraq, a lot of the youth were growing up cutting their hair like Americans and wearing tattoos, which is anathema or goes against interpretations of Islamic religion. So that was seen as something that was brought to Iraq sort of against its will. I'm not meaning to pick on the United States here because we can see the same thing happening in the United States. You can find largely Mexican districts in cities, and you can find, as we've mentioned before, Chinatowns, where it's very difficult to feel like you're in America, and the values that go along with those towns. For example, in Chinatown, they put their produce on the sidewalk. So you'll see lots of herbs and spices and fruits and vegetables on the sidewalk. And that's a value that's from an open air market in China. And Americans may look at that and say, oh, that's not clean. That is not adding cleanliness to the city. So cultural imperialism works both against countries like the U.S. and also against countries that the U.S. has been in. Next up is the idea of development communication. This is communication that's designed to speed the transformation of a country that has poverty in its culture, to speed that country from poverty to economic growth. And the communication mostly occurs through the media. The idea is that the media can be a tool of the government to try and make changes that are for the better. For example, in Ghana, Africa, I heard radio advertisements geared towards females to use underarm deodorant. Females prior to the modernization of Ghana, when they were living in tribes, do not use underarm deodorant. And so the value of a certain smelling armpit, if I can put it that way, coming from the West, is now being communicated not just as something that makes a person smell better, but also as a health concern. And that's the way that media operate when they are spreading development communication. They're spreading messages about birth control. They're spreading messages about getting a regular checkup. They're spreading messages about AIDS and HIV. They're spreading messages about the free market, about just advertising in and of itself is displaying the free market. It's giving consumers choices. And so development communication is all about spreading communication that improves a country. And key to the success of development communication are what we call opinion leaders. Opinion leaders are fathers and mothers and teachers and religious people and managers and coaches. They are people that other people look up to. I'll give an example. Just the other day I was in Kramer's, which is a home supply store. You go and you buy tools and drywall and all kinds of other things to fix up your house. And there was a guy from the board of trustees at ESU in there, and he was saying there are professors at ESU who are getting paid for working 12 hours a week. Now, he's a board of trustee member, and he was saying this, and the people who heard that he was a board of trustee member then considered him, or a council of trustee, I'm sorry, that's the official title, the council of trustee member, they assumed that he had some status, and I was concerned about that opinion getting spread around. So I introduced myself to him. I knew who he was. I'm not going to identify him here. And I said, I'd like to respectfully disagree with you. The professors that I work with are extremely hardworking, conducting research, evaluating papers, working on their classes all the time. You may find some examples of some that are only working 12 hours a week, but that is not the vast majority. And I've been here at ESU for 22 years. So there's an opinion leader in effect. That's how opinions work. People who have a certain status are looked to by others. And in this case, I was concerned that the Kramer's employees would sort of take his statement as fact. Next up is the idea of change agent ethics. And this is speaking to a culture's resistance to change or willingness to accept change. For example, birth control is seen as something that improves the standing of the world because it helps to slow down population growth. And we're going to have a huge problem with supplying the population of the world with food as our population continues to increase. So birth control is something that is often said to be a health awareness that most countries should have. But if you go to many Catholic countries, Mexico being one of them, it's very difficult for that country to adopt birth control because at least some interpretations of Catholicism prohibit birth control, and certainly the morning after pill. And so you have a country like Mexico that continues to produce a lot of children each and every year. It is a sort of resistant to change because of an ethic that it has that birth control goes against Catholic teachings. Next up is the idea of quality circles. It's a case study that the book talks about. It talks about how after World War II, Japan was decimated, had no industry, no managers that were, well, not no managers, but did not have a managerial style that stood out. And Americans rebuilt Japan after World War II, and we brought with us a lot of our management styles in jobs. And one of the particular techniques of our style is called a quality circle, where you have 3 to 10 employees that work every single day on trying to improve the quality of a product. So Japan took that up. And by the way, it worked both ways. The book doesn't talk about this, but in Japan, the workers do calisthenics before they begin their job. They show up and they will do jumping jacks and they will do push-ups and sit-ups. And so we adopted that for a while in our workplace environment here in the United States in the 1980s. We don't do it anymore because companies often now will have their own gyms in their companies, and employees can use that during their lunch. But it's an example of how the intermingling of the two cultures, Japan and the United States, both countries were changed through that intermingling, and the quality circle is one example of that. Next up is the idea of cultural icons. Cultural icons are symbols that are idolized. They're idolized. Maybe you're going to be road tripping this summer and you're going to be driving across Pennsylvania, I don't know, and you're hungry. And there's a lot of green in Pennsylvania. There's a lot of mountains, and you can go for miles and miles without coming to an exit. And then suddenly you come over a mountaintop and you see the Golden Arches. The Golden Arches, your savior, providing you with a delicious tasting cheeseburger, fries, and a soda. That's sort of the classic American meal. I'm talking about McDonald's. The McDonald's Golden Arches are an icon, a symbol that has great meaning, even to the point that it's idolized if you're in a state of despair about being hungry. And the Golden Arches represent, something is golden, it's like you've won the big treasure. And when you see the giant M, it's like an M for McDonald's, it's also an M for mountain. It has so many different ways of meaning to the person who sees that. Every country has those symbols that are idolized by its people. And when countries interact with each other, you learn what those symbols are to others. Like about the yin and the yang, which we've talked about several times in this class. It's an idolized symbol in China. Next up is the concept of cultural hegemony. This is the predominant influence of one culture over another. And it occurs sometimes through what we consider to be the back door. Consider France, for example. France is a country that has a dining tradition that is very different from the United States. When you go to France, you eat in stages, or you eat in courses, as it's called. So you have an appetizer, then you have an entree, and then comes the dessert. And then after that comes a digestive, which is a little, almost a shot glass of alcohol. It's similar to grain alcohol, but it has a flavor to it like apricot. And you sip that, and it helps break up the food that you've just eaten. So the French meal can take 2.5 to 3 hours. It's a slow process, and the waiter is not supposed to arrive at your table right away because it's understood that the people dining want it to be a special occasion, and you want to sit and relax and enjoy each other's company, and then will come the meal. It's not about moving you in and out to turn over the tables, as is the system in most restaurants in the U.S. So when you have McDonald's ads and Burger King ads and Wendy's ads and KFC ads that are in American media that are being watched on television in France or precede a film that is being watched in France, what you start to have happen is the youth of the culture is starting to eat differently. And now they are no longer sitting down with their parents for a long meal. Now they are no longer eating this slow method. They are shoving their food and eating in their cars and having food fast. Well, this is an example of cultural hegemony. It's the influence of one culture over another, and it's kind of a forceful influence. That's why countries like Canada and France actually have a quota for the maximum amount of English language programming on television that is allowed into their country. And the maximum amount of English language songs are allowed into their countries is to try and control hegemony. The book goes on to discuss cultural items that are icons from the U.S., cultural icons from the U.S., ones that have almost worldwide appeal. You can read through those on your own, but Coca-Cola, Disney, McDonald's, KFC, Spam, and Nike. These are all companies that have symbols, whether it's the check mark, the golden arches, or the KFC, which used to be Kentucky Fried Chicken, but was changed to KFC because it had too much of an exclusively Southern appeal to it. A place like McDonald's, what comes with those cultural items is efficiency and predictability and control. The predictability means that if you order a cheeseburger in Stroudsburg, it's going to taste the same as if you order a cheeseburger in Miami. That's what comes along with cultural symbolism. And next up is adapting the message. This is all about if you want to be successful as a culture and your message is being accepted by another culture, you have to adapt those messages to that culture. So for example, to go back to McDonald's and Coke and all those companies, when they advertise in Asia, they are much more aware that the group is more important to the average person than the individual. So their ads, for example, will feature groups of people rather than individuals. It's a way of communicating the message, advertising McDonald's products, but using the host country's values to shape that message so it's adapted to them. Cultures that don't do that, like the Gerber company, Gerber Baby Foods, the book talks about how successful Gerber Baby Foods was, but actually there's a big failure on the part of Gerber Baby Foods, which fits right into this adapting the message item that I'm talking about now. When Gerber marketed its baby food to Africa, it has the head of a baby on the bottle, right? And the head of the baby has that cute little curl in the hair and the cherubic smile. But guess what? African cultures look at the label to see what they think is on the inside of the bottle. So you guess what happened, right? Or the jar, I should say. Gerber baby food didn't do well with that head on it because Africans thought, I'm not eating that, that's a baby's head. As silly as that sounds, that's an example of how adapting the message can go very wrong. Finally, the book ends with a case study of religious missionary work. I'll leave you to read that on its own, but this will now wrap up our chapter 13 on contact between cultures. Have a, great day.